You're listening to Heart of the Ark podcast from the Office for Evangelization in the Archdiocese of Newark. We're coming to you to bring knowledge and some courage as we voyage through this life as missionary disciples of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Hello and welcome to the Heart of the Ark. My name is Jennifer Benke, recording this for Dilexit Nos in a Year, Session 8, paragraphs 24 through 27 of Chapter 1, underneath the subtitle, Fire. Love of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, embrace my heart. Fire of the Heart of Jesus, inflame my heart. Charity of the Heart of Jesus, fill my heart. Strength of the Heart of Jesus, sustain my heart. Mercy of the Heart of Jesus, pardon my heart. Patience of the Heart of Jesus, do not forsake my heart. Reign of the Heart of Jesus, establish yourself in my heart. Wisdom of the Heart of Jesus, teach my heart. Will of the Heart of Jesus, guide my heart. Zeal of the Heart of Jesus, consume my heart. Jesus, make our hearts more like your own. Paragraph 24, the subsection is called Fire. All that we have said has implications for the spiritual life. For example, the theology underlying the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola is based on affection, or affectus. The structure of the exercises assumes a firm and heartfelt desire to rearrange one's life, a desire that in turn provides the strength and the wherewithal to achieve that goal. The rules and the compositions of that place that Ignatius furnishes are in the service of something much more important, namely the mystery of the human heart. Michel de Certeau shows how the movements of which Ignatius speaks are the inbreaking of God's desire and the desire of our own heart amid the orderly progression of the meditations. Something unexpected and hitherto unknown starts to speak in our heart, breaking through our superficial knowledge and calling it into question. This is the start of a new process of setting our life in order, beginning with the heart. It is not about intellectual concepts that need to be put into practice in our daily lives, as if effectivity in practice were merely the effects of and dependent upon the data of knowledge. Where the thinking of the philosopher halts, there the heart of the believer presses on in love and adoration, in pleading for forgiveness and in willingness to serve in whatever place the Lord allows us to choose, in order to follow in his footsteps. At that point, we realize that in God's eyes, we are a thou, and for that very reason, we can be an I. Indeed, only the Lord offers to treat each one of us as a thou, always and forever. Accepting his friendship is a matter of the heart. It is what constitutes us as persons in the fullest sense of that word. St. Bonaventure tells us that in the end we should not pray for light, but for the raging fire. He teaches that faith is in the intellect in such a way as to provoke affection. In this sense, for example, the knowledge that Christ died for us does not remain knowledge, but necessarily becomes affection or love. Along the same line, St. John Henry Newman took as his motto the phrase cor ad cor loquitur, since beyond all our thoughts and ideas, the Lord saves us by speaking to our hearts from his sacred heart. This realization led him, the distinguished intellectual, to recognize that his deepest encounter with himself and with the Lord came not from his reading or reflection, but from his prayerful dialogue heart to heart with Christ, alive and present. It was in the Eucharist that Newman encountered the living heart of Jesus, capable of setting us free, giving meaning to each moment of our lives and bestowing true peace. O most sacred heart, most loving heart of Jesus, thou art concealed in the Holy Eucharist, and thou beatest for us still I worship thee then with all my best love and awe, with my fervent affection, with my most subdued, most resolved will. O my God, when thou dost condescend to suffer me to receive thee, to eat and drink thee, and thou for a while takest up thy abode within me, O make my heart beat with thy heart. Purify it of all that is earthly, all that is proud and sensual, all that is hard and cruel, of all perversity, of all disorder, of all deadness. So fill it with thee that neither the events of the day nor the circumstances of the time may have power to ruffle it, but that in thy love and thy fear it may have peace. Before the heart of Jesus, living and present, our mind, enlightened by the Spirit, grows in understanding of his words, and our will is moved to put them into practice. This could easily remain on the level of a kind of self-reliant moralism, hearing and tasting the Lord and paying him due honor, however, is a matter of the heart. Only the heart is capable of setting our other powers and passions and our entire person in a stance of reverence and loving obedience before God. So Pope Francis gives us 3 sources from which to grab onto some more detail here. The first one is again from Michel de Certeau, and Michel Certeau did an incredible job of breaking down the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola in a modern context. And I found this article in English. Michel Certeau is in French, so breaking it down from Dominique Céline, it says, in the first place, there is a desire. When we're talking about mysticism, when we're talking about contemplation, we're talking about the spiritual exercises and entering into a dialogue with God, okay, in our prayer life. It says, in the first place, there is a desire which is called to escape from the narrow limits and from clinging adhesion in order to take on the form of divine indifference, proper to God who is always greater. And to become indifferent, the human will must in the first place want to be so. To ask for what I want, the retreatant is invited to do this at the start of each period of meditation. Here one wants to want nothing, or more precisely, to prefer nothing. The will cannot be magnetized simply by what the person alone wants. That must come about thanks to the affectus, that's the word that Pope Francis uses here, or the movements, which are the eruptions of God's will into the human will. Thanks to the discernment that takes place over several days, it becomes possible to establish a new order where before there was disorder. On the threshold of the exercises, the principle and foundation inaugurates a break with regard to all that has gone before. This cutoff point is the frontier of a space which allows that to speak. And that condition that makes possible a new communication is not one of satisfaction or repletion. On the contrary, it is a non-possession, a break and an absence. I think these are important ideas that when we're meditating, we're learning how to listen and how to be still and how to ask the Lord to allow us to hear his heart. His heart, we know, is so much bigger than our human hearts. It's the inexorable, inexhaustible love of being, of creation, of all that is and ever was in terms of love. And so therefore, in order for us to ask him to allow us to hear how his heart beats, we need to find ways to dispossess ourselves of our own desires, our own perspectives, our own wants here. So that's a really important distinction when we're talking about those spiritual exercises. Another part of what Pope Francis is talking about here is the St. Bonaventure, Itinerarium mentis in Deum, that is referenced here. I found an English translation of St. Bonaventure's words. So it says, moreover, if you seek in what manner these things occur, interrogate grace, not doctrine. Desire, not understanding, the groan of praying, not the study of reading. the spouse, not the teacher, God, not man, darkness, not brightness, not light, but the fire totally inflaming, transferring one into God, both by excessive unctions and by the most ardent affections. And that last quote that from Pope Francis actually was most recently quoted by Benedict XVI. And he's quoting Benedict XVI. Pope Benedict XVI is quoting St. Bonaventure, saying, "Faith is in the intellect in such a way that it provokes affection. For example, the knowledge that Christ died for us does not remain knowledge, but necessarily becomes affection and love." Everything is saying here is that, there's a difference between knowing the facts of our faith, knowing the catechism, knowing the Bible stories, and the relationship. There's a difference between the relationship of a personal knowing what Jesus Christ has done to redeem me, Jen Benke, or you, listener of Heart of the Ark, your personal relationship with Jesus. And we think about this sometimes as Catholics and we say, oh, that's a very Protestant concept. Well, no, it's not. Pope Francis is pointing out here that it's been with us from the beginning of Philip. It's been with us, in Paul's writings. It's, obviously in the John's Gospel, when he talks so much about listening to that heartbeat of Jesus, the beloved disciple at the Last Supper with his head on Jesus's chest, right? Like listening to the heartbeat. And that's what we've been trying to get to, that we understand as our birthright, as our holiness grows, as our understanding of discipleship grows, as our imitation of Jesus in prayer, in contemplating, in asking God to enlarge our hearts, to make our hearts more like His, that we start to become these bigger vessels of truth. We start to understand, at least comprehend more of the love of God. And as we do that, we become more Christ-like, but we also make space in our lives for perspectives and others in a relational way. This is the work of a Christian, right? This is not just the work of one type of a person or another, or a political party or another, or a social action movement or another. This is the work of a Christian in order to grow a heart capable of loving in any way more like the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which we start every beginning and end, every one of these weeks with, is to start to figure out, how do we contemplate? How do we hold this space for others? How do we make our lives more accommodating? Not in any way to put ourselves down, but to think of ourselves less. Not to not think of ourselves, or not to deny ourselves, but to think of ourselves less and others more, in order that we may experience God through others. So as our closing, Pope Francis gives us the words of John Henry Newman. I'm going to use my favorite prayer, The Pillar in the Cloud, by John Henry Newman, St. John Henry Newman. Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom. Lead thou me on. The night is dark, and I am far from home. Lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet. I do not ask to see the distant scene. One step enough for me. I was not ever thus, nor prayed that thou shouldst lead me on. I love to choose and see my path, but now lead thou me on. I love the garish day in spite of fears. Pride ruled my will. Remember not past years. So long thy power hath blessed me, sure it still will lead me on, o'er moor and fen, o'er crag and torrent, till the night is gone. And with the morn those angel faces smile. which I have loved long since and lost a while. From all of us at Heart of the Ark, this is Dilexit Nos in a year. Thank you so much for joining us.
Heart of the Ark podcast is an initiative by the Office for Evangelization at the Archdiocese of Newark. If you want to find us online, you can find us at rcan.org/evangelization. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram. Very soon we'll be updating our social media for the Heart of the Ark, but you can find us on Fireside Podcasts at heartoftheark.fireside.fm. Our theme song is composed by and orchestrated by Eric Hunter, a dear friend of mine. You can find out more about Eric and his performances and compositions at Eric, E-R-I-C, Hunter, H-U-N-T-E-R, music.com. This has been a pleasure, and I look forward to hearing from you and speaking with you in the future.